Here's your passage with proper punctuation and clarity while keeping it simple. To face himself, he had to sit in the discomfort of knowing he had been the fool in the room. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time he started listening more and talking less. Maybe it was time he started thinking before assuming he knew everything. The flight attendant passed by again, and for the first time, Nathan didn't wave her down for another drink. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the sky as the plane began its descent into Tampa, and he realized something: this wasn't about Pam Bondi. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be from here on out. How often do we judge people before we even know who they are? How many times have we let arrogance blind us to the truth? She looks familiar, he went on, tilting his head. Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type: big hair, expensive handbag, and no idea how to blend in. His words floated into the space around him, catching the ears of those nearby. A few glanced in his direction, but the woman remained focused on her iPad, either unaware or uninterested in his commentary. That didn't sit well with him. People like her were supposed to care what men like him thought. The plane began taxiing, and the flight attendant made her final rounds, checking seat belts and collecting empty glasses. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored with the flight before it had even begun. He watched as the blonde woman politely handed off her drink and smiled at the attendant. Her posture was composed, her demeanor calm. It irritated him. There was a quiet confidence about her, an ease that. He shifted, making sure his voice carried just enough. She must have married well, he mused, shaking his head as if he found the entire thing amusing. That's usually how these stories go. Third husband, maybe fourth. Plastic surgeons on speed dial. It's always the same. This time, there was a noticeable shift in the air. The businessman in the seat across the aisle cast a glance at him, brief but pointed. The flight attendant hesitated ever so slightly as she moved past. Even the man sitting next to him exhaled quietly, as if he wished himself anywhere else. Nathan, of course, didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. Victim, don't they? Always looking for a cause to latch onto, some way to make themselves the center of attention. Maybe she'll post a picture of her airport chic outfit, too, something that says, "Look at me, I'm so effortless," but really, it's all an act. She wants to be seen, but only on her terms. Nathan paused for a moment, studying the blonde woman, waiting for a sign that he was getting under her skin. He was growing increasingly frustrated by her complete indifference. It was as if she didn't even hear him, like he was invisible. The flight attendant returned, this time with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Nathan didn't care. He was too wrapped up in his own commentary. "Another drink, sir?" she asked, clearly eager to move on. He waved her off, his attention still fixed on the woman ahead of him. "No, thanks," he muttered, his words dripping with disdain. "Just keep an eye on her. She's not as subtle as she thinks." The attendant gave a polite nod and walked away, but Nathan was already too deep in his thoughts to notice. He glanced around, convinced that everyone was either silently agreeing with him or just too afraid to speak up. A few people had shifted in their seats, but none had directly acknowledged his comments. To him, it felt like validation. His seatmate, still pretending to read his book, sighed quietly. Nathan didn't care. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to entertain himself, to show off his sharp wit to an audience that seemed too dull to appreciate it. But that's when the shift happened. The blonde woman, who had been glued to her tablet this whole time, suddenly set it down. She adjusted in her seat, her eyes briefly scanning the cabin. She wasn't looking at Nathan, not directly. But the small, knowing smile she gave before turning back to her device sent a chill down his spine. It was a smile that said she'd heard every word, understood every jab, but had chosen to let it roll off her. Nathan opened his mouth, ready to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to figure out what this reaction meant. She hadn't reacted in the way he expected. It was the kind of response that unsettled him, a reminder that sometimes, silence could be the most powerful answer of all. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, taking a long sip from his drink. This was no longer fun. In fact, it felt a little too real. He glanced at the woman again, but she was already back to scrolling through her tablet, calm and unfazed. And just like that, Nathan realized something. He wasn't the main character here, he never had been. Victim, but I guarantee you. Excuse me sir, the voice was confirmed. Nathan turned his head expecting the flight attendant again. Instead he found himself looking at the blonde woman herself for the first time. She had turned fully toward him, her expression anger, no irritation, just a look, a quiet measured look that made Nathan suddenly hyper-aware of here's your passage with punctuation added for clarity and flow. The way his own voice had been carrying, for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of something uncomfortable, something foreign. But he shook it off. He met her gaze, waiting for her to say something, to scold him, argue with him, anything that would justify his behavior. But unreadable there was no. She didn't. She just studied him for a moment, then gave the faintest, most unreadable smile before turning back to her tablet like he wasn't worth her time. And for the first time, Nathan felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Nathan shifted in his seat, adjusting his cufflink as if that could smooth over the discomfort creeping into his chest. That look she had given him, it wasn't dismissive. It wasn't irritated. It was something worse. It was knowing, like she had seen 100 men just like him before and had already decided he wasn't worth the effort. That should have made it easier to brush off, to roll his eyes and go back to a scotch, but it didn't. Instead, it gnawed at him. The flight attendant returned with his drink, setting it down with a polite nod before moving past him. He noticed she didn't offer any lingering attention, no small talk, no warmth. Had she heard him too? He took a slow sip, letting the ice clink against the glass, then glanced at the woman. Again. Pam, he reminded himself. He still didn't know exactly who she was, but something about her name tickled at the back of his mind. She was still reading, still unbothered. But now that she had acknowledged him once, there was an invisible line drawn between them, a silent dare. Nathan didn't do well with dares, so he said, this time directly to her, pitching his voice low enough to seem casual but loud enough that the people around them could still catch bits of it. Pam, is it? You don't look like a Pam. She didn't answer. A flicker of something twisted in his stomach, but he didn't stop. I mean, no offense, he added, it's just. I don't know. You look more like a Kelly or a Lauren. He chuckled, shaking his head. Pam sounds like someone's mom. Still nothing. Nathan shifted again. She wasn't just ignoring him now, she was letting him embarrass himself. Across the aisle, the older gentleman had gone back to his paper, but Nathan had caught the way he glanced up at him earlier, judging. 2 rows ahead, a younger man in a business suit was pretending to type on his laptop, but Nathan knew the game. He was listening. Even the flight attendant, who had just passed by with a tray, was keeping an eye on him out of the corner of her eye. The realization made Nathan's stomach tighten. They weren't laughing with him. He exhaled sharply through his nose, sitting back in his seat. Fine. Let them judge. People were always so uptight these days, acting like a little light-hearted teasing was